to African Affairs, the television program on Africa. We are in the studio of Video Photo Solution in Hyattsville, Maryland, United States of America. I have two guests here, two academicians. One is Professor Suleiman Enyang, who has been about 2 or 3 times chairman of the Department of African Studies at Howard University, where he is still currently. He is currently still there. He's currently there. And Professor Alim Hailu, who has been with me in this program for a very long time, and in fact since its inception, he is also at Howard University, Department of African Studies. Both of them are professors. Welcome, gentlemen, to this program.
Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about South Africa. South Africa, the colonization of South Africa is quite different from other colonization of other African countries, in that the British and the Dutch came in there, I think it was during their passage to the Far East. They continued stopping at the tip of South Africa, and from there they acquired lands and then went in. They had conflicts with the Africans at that time, and then, of course, with the speedy armament, they conquered the Africans and entrenched themselves in South Africa. You had the British and the Dutch. There was also conflict between the British and the Dutch. We heard about the Great Trek, when the Boers trekked from the coast to the hinterland, because the British was insisting that they should treat the Africans well. Then after the Boer War, the British took upper hand. Then emerged it was called the Union of South Africa, which later on became a Republic of South Africa. They declared independence. And then they introduced the odious apartheid policy. Some of the leaders here were Botha and Verwoerd. Verwoerd was later assassinated in the house. The policy of apartheid was very, very tragic in the lives of South Africans. This is a policy that was legalized by the government. That's one thing with apartheid. The government said this is the policy. They promoted this by different acts. The Population Act, the other types of acts, residential acts, the carrying of passport and other identities to show which racial group you belong. Now, but this, the thing that attracted world attention was the Soweto massacre, where children of Soweto were forced to learn Afrikaner as a language. They wouldn't speak their own language. They marched on the street and they were gunned down. This attracted the attention of the world, and then sanctions were tightened against South Africa. During this period, gentlemen, what was it that characterized this period of apartheid? Because you cannot talk of South Africa now without remembering what happened in apartheid. Professor Nyang.
Yeah, when we talk about South Africa, we take into account certain historical landmarks which define the nature of that society. If you recognize the fact, as you pointed out, when Vasco da Gama came south of Cape Bojado and come all the way down to the southern part of the continent and cross the Cape of Good Hope, that was a turning point in terms of European penetration of the whole continent. That is why the Portuguese were able to use the word Africa to cover the whole continent, because the word Africa did not mean the whole continent, it meant only North Africa. But the Portuguese, at that time, when they were able to go to the Cape of Good Hope and then all the way to what we now call Mozambique, you see, the Portuguese were the ones who used the term Africa to mean the whole continent, because all the Greeks and the Arabs, Africa meant only North Africa, what we now call Libya and Tunisia. But the whole continent now is called Africa. This is very significant in terms of South African history, because you're at the tip All these other African nations were known. Ethiopians were known. That was why you have a mythology of the Europeans looking for Prester John, whom they thought was in Ethiopia. That's where the Ethiopian narrative comes directly to the South African narrative and the Portuguese narrative and the European narrative. So South Africa becomes important in the sense that the Dutch came there. The Dutch were the rivals to the Spaniards and the English, who were the three dominant maritime groups. The Dutch is a small country, but they were able to establish themselves in South Africa. But they will be eked out of that place by the British, who had their ambition of building India and controlling the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The Dutch maintained control in the Indonesia, which is closer to China and other areas. And the British will leave them in those places after kicking them out of South Africa. This is a very important point for us, because you see, when you look at South Africa, therefore, the people we call Afrikaans, who are the architect of apartheid, they came from Holland and settled in this part, and they took power from the Portuguese. These Afrikaans, they are part of the Teutonic groups. They are all English, Dutch, German, and the Scandinavian. They are all Teutonic people. When they took power in South Africa, they will be rivaled by the English. That is why if you go to South Africa, demographically and ethnologically, you will see Cape Town is English territory. But if you go to the Orange River, you go up, north of Limpopo area, you go up there, you find the Afrikaans who were traders and settlers. And they live with the Africans. So these Afrikaans, they were Boer people, they were Dutch. But they changed their name to Afrikaans. They say, we are Africans, and all these blacks are not Africans. They are Bantu. And that's the intellectual basis of this apartheid, because what happened is, the Boers found themselves in a very interesting situation. After the Dutch lost power, so you have these Dutch settlers who now live in Africa as settler colonizers, just like the English. But the English, once they took over, they brought into South Africa Indians. This is the arithmetic, the ethnic arithmetic of South Africa. You have the Dutch, who settled as colonialists, who became Boers, who settled. And they created their own language, which is not the Dutch that you speak in, this Africanized a little bit. They call themselves Afrikaners. Okay, and then you have the English, and then you have the Indians, and then you have the vast majority of ethnic groups in South Africa, and this is echoed in the South African language policy. You have the Zulu, you have the Xhosa, Mandela's group. You have to do the click. Xhosa group, you have the Sotos, you have the Swanas, etc., 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 and you have the Nama. The Nama are very light skinned. But they are light-skinned because they have pygmy background, because they're protected from the sun, so they're lighter a little bit than the other blacks. But you have all these different groups. Apartheid is a British discrimination that existed, but it was not institutionalized until 1948 by the Afrikaans, who took power from the English. From 1948 until the end of apartheid in 1994, you have this period of African domination. And gradually there was this process of discrimination of black people. This is how the ANC would be founded. Just at the same time, the NAACP was founded here in America. So to conclude the story, what I would say to you, to all of us here, is that when we talk about South Africa, what we have to recognize is that apartheid, the great bane of political misery for Africans in South Africa, came out of Afrikaner domination. But it is the higher form of discrimination the British has established through the collar bar, what they call the collar bar. You see, so when we talk about apartheid South Africa, therefore, you have to recognize the struggle of black people. Black people, since Saka the Zulu and many other nationalist movements fighting the Europeans. But you see, the Europeans succeeded because they have better weapons. They have the Maxim gun. They wiped out the African groups and took over power.
Okay. So, all right, now let's go to, you mentioned the struggle. They mentioned ANC, the creation of ANC. Yes. Now, the blacks in South Africa did not fold their hands and watch themselves demonized, enslaved. They resorted to armed struggle. They formed ANC, African National Congress. And some of the leaders were Nelson Mandela and Sizulu and others anyway. Now, Nelson Mandela was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole because of his activities in ANC, where he championed the struggle for liberation of the people of, or the blacks of South Africa from the yoke of the white imperialism. How do you describe this struggle, and how effective was it in fighting apartheid in South Africa?
I think, as noted, almost all nations in the world are shaped by what goes on within their borders and what goes on in the world. And South Africa is no exception. The expansion of Europe into what's usually called the New World passed through the oceans of the Atlantic Oceans of Africa, all the way from northwest Africa down to the tip of South Africa. And that shaped the current South Africa as a nation also. But the tragedy was that the people who came to settle there, the Dutch and the others, I guess you could say they could have shaped institutions that were fairly representative of the populations and had allowed other groups to have a stake in all aspects of governance. But they chose to have a semi-colonial relationship with the majority African population there, even though they had every right to call themselves Africans because they had moved there for over 2 centuries to live there. But they staked out a claim that they were the Africans. The others, in fact, they even started claiming that they were there before the Bantus moved from northern part of the continent. That created a system of apartheid, which is a segregated, officially segregated form of governance. And the tragedy is, even though they had practiced it until 1948, before that it was more non-official way of doing their dominant power structure. In 1916, when the ANC was formed, as Dr. Nyang said, it was fashioned along the lines of NAACP, a very peaceful transition type of institution that wanted to have a peaceful share of power with other groups. But when this was banned and they were criminalized in 1948, it assumed a militant ideology. And afterwards, the armed struggle was taken as part of the struggle against apartheid. So the brunt of the suffering and the struggle was borne by Africans in South Africa. But as Desmond Tutu said, they were both supported and thwarted by the world also. There were groups during the Cold War that supported the racist regime, apartheid regime, that almost Nazi-like laws that prohibited living, prohibited associations between the vast majority of blacks with whites, pushed people out of their lands into homelands. And this created the condition for the struggle. As the struggle moved, conditions in the world changed. They were supported by African nations.